3 days had passed since Marlon Graves last saw a paycheck. The rain over Chicago had turned cold and thin, the kind that soaked through a jacket without ever looking like much at all. In his pocket sat exactly $8, enough for one hot meal and nothing else. He walked past the diner window twice before going inside, counting the bills again, as if they might multiply through sheer will. The woman behind the counter knew him by now, and slid the box across without asking questions. He thanked her the way he always did, quiet and a little tired, and stepped back out into the drizzle, holding the only food he would have that day. He had barely made it to the corner when he saw her, a woman folded into herself against the brick wall, shivering under a coat too thin for the weather. An old newspaper vendor nearby shook her head slowly. "She has not eaten since yesterday," the vendor said, her voice low, almost apologetic, as though the fact embarrassed the whole street. Marlon looked down at the box in his hands for a long moment. He did not know her name. He did not know anything about her at all. But he knelt down anyway and held it out, and the woman took it with fingers that trembled from more than just the cold. He walked away without waiting for thanks, cupping his hands under a public water fountain a block later, because that would be his dinner instead. What he never saw was the black sedan idling at the far end of the street, or the tiny camera mounted above the awning of a shuttered pharmacy, quietly recording every second. What he could not have known was that the woman he had just fed was not homeless at all. She was Vivienne Ashcroft, one of the wealthiest women in the country, and she had been waiting on that corner for exactly this kind of person to walk by. The limousine door opened, the instant Marlon turned the corner and disappeared from view. Vivienne rose from the pavement slowly, the coat still damp against her shoulders, and slid into the back seat without a word. Her security detail straightened at once, the casual slouches of men pretending to be strangers snapping into something sharper. This had been an experiment for 3 weeks running, a private survey of who this city really was beneath its polished storefronts, and until tonight it had mostly confirmed her worst suspicions about people. Inside the car, she peeled off the coat and handed it to an assistant without looking at him. Her real clothes waited folded on the seat, tailored wool the color of dark stone, nothing like the second-hand fabric she had just worn for 6 hours in the cold. Grant Holloway was already on speaker before she had even finished changing, his voice clipped and impatient through the car's speakers. "Another wasted evening," he said. "We have actual matters that require your attention, Miss Ashcroft." Vivienne did not answer him directly. "Find that man," she said instead. "Tell me everything about him, but do not tell him anything about me." Grant scoffed audibly on the other end of the line. "People like that always perform kindness the moment they sense a camera," he said. "It means nothing once the cash runs out." Vivienne almost smiled at how certain he sounded. "I want to verify it myself," she said, and ended the call before he could argue further. In the back of the car, alone now, she looked at her own hands and thought of the way the stranger had knelt down without hesitation, without calculation, as though giving away his last meal was simply the only decision available to him. Miles away, Marlon had no idea that any of this was happening. He walked the last 4 blocks home in the rain, his stomach empty, his shoes soaked through at the seams. He passed 3 more businesses with hiring signs in the window and stopped at each one, filling out applications on a cracked phone screen that barely still worked. Too experienced for entry level. One manager told him flatly. Too old for the physical requirements, said another. Though physical requirements had nothing to do with a warehouse desk job. He nodded each time, thanked them for their time, and kept walking because there was nothing else to do. At the 4th place, a warehouse distribution center on the edge of town, a young manager barely out of college looked over his resume with visible confusion. "You've done this work for 20 years, the manager said. "Why are you applying for an entry-level position now?" Marlon explained patiently that the plant where he had spent most of his career had shut down 2 years earlier, that the severance had long since run out. That pride mattered a good deal less than keeping a roof over his head. The manager promised to call back within the week. The call never came. At the 5th place, he waited nearly 2 hours, past his scheduled appointment time, only to be told the position had already been filled that morning, though the listing remained active online for another 11 days afterward. He did not complain. He simply thanked the receptionist, gathered his folder, and stepped back out into a city that seemed to have decided, quietly and without explanation, that a 41-year-old man with 2 decades of steady experience, was somehow no longer worth the trouble of hiring. He had no idea a woman worth more money than he could imagine was, at that very moment, deciding his life was about to change, in ways neither of them could yet predict. His apartment that night was cold, the radiator having given up weeks earlier without the landlord bothering to send anyone to fix it. Marlon sat at the small kitchen table where he and his late wife used to eat dinner together, the chair across from him still pushed in the exact way she used to leave it. He kept a single photograph propped against the salt shaker, her smile frozen in a summer years gone, and he spoke to it sometimes the way other men might speak to a friend on the phone, quietly, without expecting an answer back. "Tough one today," he told the photograph, "though I think I did all right by that woman on the corner." He believed, in that moment, that the gesture had already ended. A small kindness, offered and forgotten by morning, the way most kindnesses are. He had no way of knowing that somewhere across the city, in a glass tower, he had never once had reason to enter, his face was already being studied on a private screen, his simple act already setting something enormous into motion. Vivienne Ashcroft had built her company from a single trading desk in a rented office 2 decades earlier, back when nobody bothered to pronounce her name correctly, and every investor she approached assumed she was someone's assistant, rather than the person actually running the meeting. She remembered those years with more clarity than the wealth that came afterward, remembered how often kindness back then had come attached to a hidden invoice, a favor extended only because someone expected a return on it eventually. By the time Ashcroft Global had grown into the sprawling conglomerate it now was, she had grown quietly convinced that unconditional decency simply did not exist anymore, not at scale, not among strangers who had nothing to gain from extending it. That belief had calcified into something like policy. Every quarter, she left her office for a week at a time, dressed as someone with nothing, testing the city the way a scientist tests water for contamination, searching for even a single result that might prove her wrong. Most weeks confirmed exactly what she expected. People stepped over each other for convenience, for time saved, for the simple relief of not having to feel responsible for a stranger's suffering. She had almost stopped expecting anything different by the time she wandered onto that particular street corner in the rain, tired and cold in a way that had nothing to do with performance anymore, genuinely worn down by the accumulated weight of her own experiment. The following morning, Vivienne arrived at a small staffing agency, dressed as an ordinary recruiter, hair pulled back, a plain blazer, replacing the tailored coats her board members were used to seeing. Nobody in the building recognized her, which was exactly the point. She had learned years ago that people behaved very differently around someone they believed held no power over them at all. She took a seat in the corner of the waiting area and watched candidates file through, one after another, most of them barely glancing at the people around them. Marlon walked in 20 minutes later, dressed in the only pressed shirt he still owned, a resume folder tucked under one arm. He sat 3 seats away from a janitor who had just finished mopping the hallway floor and accidentally knocked over a stack of paperwork on his way past. Nobody moved to help. 2 other applicants stepped around the mess entirely, muttering something about being late for their own interviews. Marlon set his folder down without a word and knelt to gather the scattered pages, handing them back to the older man with a small nod, as if it cost him nothing at all. Vivienne watched from her corner seat, arms crossed, saying nothing. It was such a small moment, 30 seconds at most, the kind of thing easily lost in the churn of a busy morning. But she had seen enough performances in her life to know the difference between a person acting kind for an audience and a person who simply could not walk past someone in need. Marlon had not glanced around to see who was watching. He had not smiled for anyone. He had simply done the thing, then returned to his seat and continued reading over his own resume as though nothing had happened. That evening, back at Ashcroft Tower, Grant slid a folder across the polished conference table with visible satisfaction. "I had someone look into him," he said. "There is always something. There always is with people like this." Vivienne opened the folder slowly, expecting the usual list of minor debts or eviction notices that so often filled these reports. Instead, she found something else entirely, a name she did not expect to see attached to any kind of trouble at all. The folder told a different story than Grant had hoped for. Years earlier, Marlon had worked as a maintenance technician at a manufacturing plant on the south side of the city, the kind of job that rarely made headlines. One night, An electrical fault had sparked a fire near the main production line while the overnight crew slept through their break. Marlin had been the one to smell smoke first, the one who evacuated 11 workers before emergency crews arrived, the one who refused any reward when the company offered him a bonus and a promotion afterward. The report included a statement from a former coworker, a man named Harold Beck, who still remembered that night with the kind of clarity people usually reserve for their own weddings or funerals. Marlin smelled something wrong before any alarm went off. Harold had told the investigator years earlier. He did not wait for confirmation. He just started moving people out, calm the whole time, like he had rehearsed it. The report noted that Marlin had gone back inside twice more, once for a worker trapped near a jammed emergency exit, once for an elderly security guard who had frozen entirely in the smoke. When the company offered him a $5,000 bonus afterward, along with a promotion to shift supervisor, Marlin had asked instead that the money go toward replacing the faulty wiring throughout the rest of the building. What the folder also revealed was less flattering for the company itself. 2 years after the fire, Marlin had reported safety violations to a state inspector after management ignored his repeated warnings about faulty wiring elsewhere in the building. He had gone through every proper channel first, filing internal reports, requesting meetings with plant management, waiting nearly 4 months for a response that never came before, finally reaching out to the state himself. Within a month of the inspection, he had been quietly let go under the vague language of restructuring, and within 6 months, an unofficial word had spread through hiring circles that he was difficult, that he caused problems, that companies should be careful before bringing him on. Grant seized on this immediately. "See," he said, "a troublemaker. Exactly the kind of instability we cannot afford at this level." Vivienne closed the folder and set it down without answering right away. She thought of the newspaper vendor's voice on that cold street corner. The box of food passed from a stranger's hands into her own without hesitation. Grant took her silence as agreement and began drafting language to circulate quietly among partner companies, language designed to ensure Marlin's name would keep drawing rejection after rejection without anyone ever having to explain exactly why. Within 2 weeks, 4 more companies turned Marlin away, each rejection a little colder than the last, though none of them ever gave him a real reason. He assumed it was simply his age, or the gap in his resume, or bad luck stacking on top of worse luck. He had no way of knowing that somewhere above him, in an office he would never set foot in, a man he had never met was actively working to make sure he stayed unemployed. Vivienne, for her part, said nothing to Grant about her doubts. She wanted to see how far this would go, and more than that, she wanted to see how Marlin himself would respond to being ground down further still. She had learned that kindness under comfortable circumstances proved very little. It was kindness under pressure, kindness when there was truly nothing left to gain from it, that told the real story of a person's character. 3 days later, she arranged the next test herself, one far riskier than the last. The downtown train platform was crowded with the evening rush, when Vivienne, dressed once more in plain clothes and a wig that dulled her recognizable features, staggered near the edge of the platform and collapsed. She had rehearsed the motion carefully with a physician on her staff, safe but convincing, designed to look exactly like sudden cardiac distress. Commuters froze in place. Several pulled out their phones, angling for a better view rather than moving to help. A young man in a suit stepped backward, muttering something about being late for a dinner reservation. Marlin had been standing near the far end of the platform, on his way home from yet another rejected interview, his tie already loosened, his shoulders already sagging with the particular exhaustion of a day spent being told no. He heard the gasp ripple through the crowd before he saw what caused it, and he moved before he had time to think it through. He pushed past 2 people still filming with their phones raised and knelt beside the fallen woman, checking her breathing, calling for someone to phone emergency services immediately. He stayed with her for the better part of 20 minutes, holding her head steady, speaking calmly, even though she gave no response, refusing to leave when a transit worker suggested he could step aside now that help was coming. Around him, the platform slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Trains arriving and departing, commuters stepping carefully around the small scene as though it were nothing more than a spilled drink on the concrete. A woman filming from several feet away lowered her phone only when Marlin looked directly at her, and even then she lingered a moment longer before finally walking off toward her own train. Nobody else offered to help hold the woman steady. Nobody else asked if she needed water or a blanket, and Marlon found himself apologizing quietly to a stranger who could not hear him, telling her that help was almost there, that she was not alone on this cold platform, even if it felt that way. When the paramedics finally arrived, he gave them a clear account of what he had seen. The exact moment she collapsed, the way her breathing had changed, the fact that she had not responded to her name. He answered their questions patiently, waited until they confirmed she was stable enough to transport, and only then allowed himself to check his watch. The interview he had rushed to make that afternoon had ended without him 15 minutes ago. He had missed it entirely, and he stood there on the emptying platform for a long moment, feeling the particular exhaustion of having done the right thing and lost something because of it anyway. There would be no rescheduling, no apology accepted from the hiring manager, who had already left for the day. Nothing but another door closed quietly behind him, like all the others. Grant, watching the surveillance footage later that night from the safety of his office, laughed under his breath. "He is not clever," he told an assistant nearby. "A smart man would have let someone else handle it and made his interview instead." Vivienne, watching the same footage from her own office one floor above, felt something shift inside her chest that she could not immediately name. She had staged failing bodies and empty wallets in front of dozens of people over the years, testing them the way scientists test reflexes, and almost every single one of them had chosen themselves first. Marlon had chosen the stranger, again, with nothing to gain and everything still to lose. She sat with that thought long after the office had emptied out for the evening, turning it over slowly, the way one turns over a stone, looking for what might be hidden underneath. It was during this same stretch of days that Vivienne uncovered something far more troubling than anything in Marlon's own file. A junior analyst, reviewing hiring data at her request, flagged an unusual pattern buried deep in the recruitment records. Older applicants across multiple divisions were being systematically filtered out before their applications ever reached a human reviewer, quietly and consistently, over a period of nearly 4 years. The pattern led directly back to Grant's office, and from there to a series of payments routed through a staffing vendor that Ethan Doyle had personally approved every single time. The scheme was almost elegant in its simplicity. Grant had been steering hiring toward younger, cheaper candidates who came through a specific outside agency, one that paid him a quiet commission for every placement that went through without objection. Ethan, as recruitment manager, made sure any inconvenient older candidate, especially anyone who asked too many questions or showed too much independence, never made it past the first screening. The analyst's report listed name after name, 47 candidates over 4 years, most of them over the age of 45, most of them with the exact kind of experience the company claimed publicly to value above all else. Marlon had simply been the latest name caught in a machine that had already chewed through dozens of others exactly like him. Vivienne read through the list of names slowly, recognizing none of them personally, but feeling the weight of each one nonetheless, each a person somewhere in the city who had been quietly filtered out of consideration before they ever had a fair chance to prove themselves. She thought of her own early years, of how close she herself had come to being dismissed before anyone gave her room to prove what she could do, and the thought sharpened her resolve considerably. She instructed the analyst to preserve every document, every email, every commission record, building a case with the same methodical patience she had once used to build spreadsheets for investors who doubted her. Vivienne read through the numbers twice, her jaw tightening with each new figure. This was not simple bias dressed up in polite language. This was theft, dressed up as policy, running quietly beneath the surface of a company that publicly prided itself on fairness and opportunity. She said nothing to Grant. She said nothing to Ethan. Instead, she began quietly building a file of her own, gathering documents and testimonies with the same patience she had once used to build the company itself from nothing. Marlon, meanwhile, knew none of this. He knew only that his savings had run dry, that his landlord had grown short with him over the phone, and that the apartment he had lived in for 6 years since his wife passed was no longer something he could reasonably expect to keep. Linda Carver, who owned the building, had never been kind to tenants who fell behind, and she made her disappointment in Marlon's situation known every time she saw him in the hallway. He began quietly packing boxes he hoped he would not need to use, setting aside the few photographs of his late wife with more care than anything else he owned. It was in the middle of this packing, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, that an envelope arrived at his door, unlike any he had seen before. Thick paper, embossed lettering, an invitation to something called a leadership evaluation interview at Ashcroft Global. He turned it over twice, certain it had to be some kind of mistake or scam targeting people exactly in his position. He almost threw it away. But something about the paper stock, heavier than anything a scam would bother printing, made him hesitate. And in the end, hesitation won out over doubt. He decided he had nothing left to lose by showing up. The lobby of Ashcroft Tower rose 60 floors above the street, marble and glass catching the late afternoon light in a way that made Marlin feel, for a moment, entirely out of place among the pressed suits and gleaming shoes moving briskly around him. He checked in at the front desk, gave his name, and was directed toward an elevator bank reserved for what the receptionist called special evaluations. He rode up alone, watching the numbers climb, wondering if this was some elaborate mistake that would be discovered the moment he stepped off. Grant was waiting when the doors opened, flanked by two junior staff members who exchanged a quick, knowing glance the instant they saw Marlin's worn shoes and slightly too large jacket. "Mr. Graves," Grant said, his tone dripping with a courtesy that did not reach his eyes. "I am afraid there has been some confusion. This evaluation is reserved for candidates already vetted through our executive pipeline." Marlin held up the envelope, his expression calm, despite the obvious insult buried in the words. "I was invited," he said simply. "I have the letter right here if you need to see it." Grant did not even glance at the paper. "Security will show you out," he said instead, turning already toward his office, as though the matter were settled. Two guards stepped forward from either side of the lobby, hands hovering near Marlin's elbow without quite touching him, the kind of gesture meant to look polite while making the outcome unmistakable. Marlin did not argue or raise his voice. He simply stood his ground, holding the envelope a little tighter, waiting to see what would happen next. It was at that exact moment that the elevator behind Grant chimed open again, and the entire lobby seemed to inhale at once. Vivienne Ashcroft stepped out in full view for the first time that day, dressed now in the clothing that matched her name, every staff member in the room instinctively straightening, as though gravity itself had shifted toward her. Grant's confident posture faltered visibly. The security guards released Marlin's arms as if they had been burned, and Marlin, still holding his invitation, simply stared, recognizing nothing about the woman in front of him, except, somewhere far beneath conscious thought, the faint shape of a memory he could not yet place. Vivienne walked the length of the lobby without hurrying, her heels striking the marble in a rhythm that seemed to silence the entire floor. She stopped directly in front of Marlin, close enough that Grant visibly stepped back to make room. "This man is not leaving," she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "He is the reason we are all standing in this lobby today." Grant opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again, uncertain, for perhaps the first time in years, about what his employer actually intended. She led Marlin personally into the largest conference room on the executive floor, where a dozen board members and senior directors had already gathered for what they believed was a routine quarterly briefing. Vivienne asked him to sit near the head of the table, then turned to face the room, her expression unreadable. "3 weeks ago," she began, "I was sitting on a street corner in the rain, dressed as someone with nothing, and this man gave me the only meal he had left for the entire day." She gestured toward a screen at the end of the room, and the security footage from that first night appeared, grainy but unmistakable, showing Marlin kneeling beside a woman who appeared homeless, passing over a small white takeout box before walking away into the rain without waiting for thanks. The room fell utterly silent. Several board members exchanged glances, clearly trying to reconcile the man on the screen with the man now seated quietly among them, dressed in a jacket that had clearly seen too many winters. Grant's face had gone pale, then faintly gray, as the implications settled over him. Vivienne continued, without raising her voice, describing the staged collapse on the train platform, the way Marlin had stayed with a stranger for 20 minutes and missed an interview that might have saved his own apartment. One board member, an older woman named Patricia Hale, who had sat on the board since the company's founding, leaned forward and asked quietly whether the footage had been verified as authentic. Vivienne nodded once. "I was the woman on that platform," she said, and I was the woman on that street corner in the rain. I staged both moments myself, and I did not tell him, and he still chose to help a complete stranger both times, knowing nothing about who she was or what it might cost him. A ripple passed through the room at that admission, several directors exchanging glances that mixed disbelief with something closer to shame. Vivienne let the silence hold for a moment before continuing. She described the janitor's dropped paperwork, the small, unnoticed kindness that had first caught her attention, the quiet way Marlon had knelt down without looking around to see who might be watching. This man shared the last thing he had, she said, when he had absolutely nothing left to gain from it. And somewhere in this building, someone decided he was not worth hiring. Grant attempted to speak, something about standard vetting procedures and reasonable caution regarding difficult employees, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. Vivienne turned to him directly for the first time since entering the room. I have already reviewed the hiring records from the last 4 years, she said, quietly enough that the weight of it landed harder than any shout could have. I know exactly what has been happening in your department, Grant, and we will be discussing it privately very soon. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Marlon, still seated near the head of the table, felt the full strangeness of his position settle over him. He had come here believing this was some clerical mistake, and instead found himself at the center of a reckoning he had never asked for and could not fully understand yet. Vivienne turned back toward him, her expression softening slightly for the first time since she had stepped off the elevator, and for a moment the room felt smaller, quieter, as though everyone else had briefly ceased to exist. Within the week, the consequences moved swiftly and without mercy. Grant was dismissed from Ashcroft Global entirely, his severance forfeited under a clause tied directly to breach of ethical conduct, the same clause he had once used against a junior employee years earlier without a hint of hesitation. Ethan Doyle followed shortly after, his role in filtering older applicants laid bare in front of the same board that had once trusted him without question. Neither man found much sympathy waiting for them once the story of what they had done circulated quietly through the industry. Linda Carver's situation unraveled around the same time, though through an entirely separate thread of inquiry. A tenant advocacy group, alerted by an anonymous tip that traced back, though he never knew it, to Vivienne's own legal team, uncovered years of inflated fees and falsified maintenance charges levied against tenants who could least afford to fight back. The investigation found that Linda had charged repair fees for work that was never actually performed, that she had padded late payment penalties well beyond what the lease agreements permitted, and that she had specifically targeted tenants she believed were least likely to challenge her: elderly renters, single parents, and men like Marlon, who had nowhere else affordable to go. Marlon received a call one afternoon, informing him that his eviction notice had been voided entirely, along with several months of wrongly charged fees that would now be refunded directly to his account. He sat quietly at his kitchen table, after hanging up the phone, staring at the same chair his wife used to sit in, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tight for the better part of a year. He had already packed half his belongings into boxes by then, preparing for a move he had no destination for, and it took him a long moment to accept that he would not need those boxes after all, that the walls around him, worn and imperfect as they were, would remain his for a while longer. Vivienne herself requested a private meeting with Marlon soon after, away from the boardroom, away from cameras and staff, and anyone who might turn the moment into spectacle. She offered him a position she had created specifically with him in mind, Director of Corporate Culture, a role with real authority over how the entire company treated its employees, its applicants, and the communities surrounding its offices. Marlon studied the offer for a long moment before shaking his head slowly. I don't need a big title, he told her honestly. I just need people treated the way they deserve to be treated. Vivienne allowed herself a small smile, the first genuine one Marlon had seen from her since they met. That is exactly why I need the right person in that chair, she said, and I don't believe there is anyone better suited than you. She explained that the role would not be about prestige or performance, but about substance, about ensuring no one else ever slipped through the same cracks that had nearly swallowed him whole. Marlon asked her, quietly, why she had gone to such lengths in the first place, why a woman with everything already in her possession would spend weeks in the cold testing strangers who had no idea they were being watched. Vivienne considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. Because I stopped believing people could still be good without a reason to be, she said, and I needed to find out if I was wrong before I let that belief run the rest of my life. Marlon nodded slowly, understanding something in that answer that went far deeper than the words themselves suggested. A loneliness dressed up as certainty, not so different from his own after his wife had passed. He told her then about Diane, the wife he had lost 6 years earlier to an illness that had taken 18 months to finish its work, about the way grief had taught him that most of what people chased after in life meant very little once it was gone. "I learned that lesson already," he said, "the hard way, so I try not to need reminding of it." Vivienne listened without interrupting, and when he finally finished, she said only that she was sorry and that she believed Diane would have been proud of the man sitting across from her. Marlon sat with the offer a long while after that, before finally, quietly, agreeing to try. A year passed, and the transformation at Ashcroft Global became something industry publications began writing about with genuine curiosity rather than routine praise. Turnover dropped sharply across every division. Complaints about age discrimination and dismissive hiring practices all but disappeared. Marlin built training programs from the ground up, not focused on profit margins or performance metrics, but on something simpler and, in his view, far more important: how to actually see the people standing in front of you. He led sessions personally, standing before rooms full of executives who had once approved decisions like grants without a second thought, teaching them to recognize the quiet signs of someone struggling, someone overlooked, someone worth a second look rather than an automatic rejection. He never spoke about wealth or advancement in these sessions. He spoke instead about the janitor whose paperwork nobody else stopped to help with, about the small, unnoticed choices that revealed more about character than any resume ever could. He told the story of Harold Beck, the coworker from the fire years earlier, and how nobody had remembered his name in any of the official reports, even though he had been the one trapped nearest the flames. He told them about hiring managers who had once dismissed him for being too old, too experienced, too expensive to bring on board, and asked the executives in the room to consider how many good people their own policies might be filtering out without anyone ever noticing. One afternoon, a young manager raised her hand and asked him directly why he had given away his last meal to a stranger that night, in the rain, knowing he himself had nothing else to eat. Marlon thought about the question for a moment before answering. "I did not think about myself at all in that moment," he said. "I just saw someone who needed it more than I thought I did. And it turned out I was right, because I found another meal eventually. And she found something that day too, even if neither of us knew it yet." The room stayed quiet after that, the kind of quiet that meant people were actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to speak. Vivienne attended more of these sessions than her schedule technically allowed, standing quietly near the back of the room, watching him speak with the same calm conviction he had shown on that rainy street corner months earlier. She admitted to him once, over a quiet dinner neither of them had planned in advance, that the box of food he had given away that night had done something to her that years of business school and boardroom victories never had. It reminded her, she said, of exactly why she had started the company in the first place, before the noise of success had buried the reason underneath it. Their relationship grew slowly after that, without announcement, without the urgency that had defined so much of both their earlier lives. They met for coffee some mornings before the office filled with noise, sitting at a corner table where neither of them had to perform anything for anyone else. Vivienne found herself telling him things she had never told her own board members, about the early years of building the company alone, about the nights she had questioned whether any of it was worth the isolation it eventually cost her. Marlon listened the way he did with everyone, without judgment, without trying to fix what did not need fixing, simply present in a way that made the weight of her success feel a little lighter to carry. They walked sometimes through the same streets where they had first crossed paths, though neither of them ever mentioned it directly, as if naming it too plainly might somehow diminish what had grown between them. On one such evening, Vivienne asked him quietly whether he had ever imagined, standing in the rain that night with a box of food in his hands, that his life might end up here. Marlon laughed softly and admitted he had imagined nothing beyond making it home dry enough to sleep. "That is the strange thing about doing right by people," he told her. "You rarely know what it is building until long after you have already built it." It was not dramatic or sudden, this thing growing between them. It was steady and honest, and entirely unlike anything either of them had expected to find at this stage of their lives. Two people who had each, in their own separate ways, stopped believing they had anything left to be surprised by. One evening, in late autumn, almost exactly a year after that first rainy night, Marlin found himself walking past the same diner where it had all begun. The neon sign in the window flickered the same way it always had, and the sidewalk outside held the same familiar chill in the air. He noticed a man sitting against the same brick wall where Vivian had once knelt in disguise, an actual stranger this time, shoulders hunched against a wind that carried the first real bite of winter. Marlin stepped inside without hesitation and ordered 2 meals instead of one, the same simple decision he had made a year earlier, without knowing it would change the entire direction of his life. He carried both boxes back outside and knelt beside the stranger, offering one without a word of explanation, the same quiet gesture that had once been captured by a hidden camera and had eventually reshaped an entire company from the inside out. The man accepted it, with the same trembling gratitude Vivienne herself had once shown, though of course neither of them knew that. As Marlin straightened and walked on into the cooling evening air, the value of a person was never found in what they managed to accumulate for themselves, but in what they remained willing to give away, even when they believed they had nothing left at all.